Lori Heisey. I'm one of the co-research directors of STRIVE. For those who may be less familiar with STRIVE, we're a research collaboration funded by DFID that is working to try to understand and tackle the structural drivers of HIV. We're in our 6th year and just got a 2-year extension, so we're quite pleased about that. Today we're going to be hearing from 2 colleagues, Joyce Wamoe from Tanzania, from the National Medical Research Institute in Tanzania, and our colleague Kirsten Stobanow, who's from American University. Both of them have been active for the last 4 or so years in a working group that we have sponsored on trying to get a handle on what role, if any, transactional sex is playing in the very, very high rates of HIV that young women are experiencing in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we're very pleased today to have them to hear some of the results of their work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Joyce, and then I believe Kirsten will do the second half of the presentation. Okay, great. So thank you. We do have Joyce on the line. So with that, we'll go forward with Joyce.
So my name is Joyce, as introduced, and alongside my colleague Kirsten, we'll be presenting on our work from the STRIVE Transactional Sex Working Group. And today we'll be looking into our work that has looked at meaning, measurements, and implications of HIV, implications of transactional sex for HIV prevention. For our talk today, we'll be reviewing the main objectives of the working group, which are to improve evidence on the role of transactional sex in HIV for young women. Second is to improve definition and measurement of transactional sex as a distinct sexual practice. And third, to improve understanding of the motivations of transactional sex. And our ultimate goal in actually doing all this is to help inform effective structural interventions that can help reduce adolescent girls and young women's vulnerability. Before going any further, we wish to articulate our recommended definition that has actually come from the review that we've done on social science literature on transactional sex in Sub-Saharan Africa. So when we talk about transactional sex, we're actually referring to non-commercial, non-marital sexual relationships that are motivated by the implicit assumption that sex will be exchanged for material benefit or status. And we wish to emphasize that when we include non-commercial, we're actually mainly trying to distinguish this practice from sex work. So we are not referring to sex work here. But also another phrase that is definition that I think is important to highlight is aspect related to non-marital. We are talking about transactional sex in relationships that are not marital, in as much as there might be some aspects that are similar across. In the transactional sexual relationship involves some degree of emotionality between the partners, but also these are relationships that are not entirely between young women and older men, but sometimes also happen between young women and their peers. While the rate of new HIV infections have actually declined or stabilized in many populations, we find that over a third of the new HIV infections continue to occur between young women aged 15 to 24 years old. And of the women living with HIV/AIDS worldwide, we see that 15% are aged 15 to 24 years old, and of those, 80% live in Sub-Saharan Africa. As we can actually see in that graph, there is a significant age-sex disparity in HIV acquisition, and we see that prevalence in young women across Sub-Saharan Africa is more than twice as it is among young men from the region. And in South Africa, we can see it's 8 times even higher among young women compared to young men. So STRIVE's work on transactional sex indicates that it's really important to tackle some of the factors that contribute to this disproportionate risk, in particular transactional sex. Next slide. As mentioned in the beginning, we set out to actually address 3 research questions, and I'll start off with the first one that we asked ourselves in the group, which is why is transactional sex important for young women's HIV risk? At individual and interpersonal level, studies have pointed to an association between transactional sex and HIV risk behaviors. For example, behaviors around violence, multiple partners, alcohol use, but also condom use as having a direct relationship with transactional sex. But what still remains is the evidence actually that links transactional sex with HIV/AIDS that remains really unclear. So based on that, we set out to understand if the relationship that existed between transactional sex and HIV. And in doing that, we conducted a systematic review where we ended up with 16 studies being included, and 14 of those studies provided data on women, while 7 were exclusively on young women aged 13 to 26. 10 of the studies provided data on men, while 4 were exclusively on young men. 3 studies provided measures of associations that are not sex disaggregated, while 14 studies were cross-sectional or employed repeated cross-sectional design. Majority of the studies in the review came from South Africa, and 9 of the studies included in that. The majority of those studies actually came from general populations, while only 7 draw from specific population groups, and those examples of those were women attending, for example, a reproductive health clinic. 9 studies out of the 16 met inclusion criteria for meta-analysis, and 5 of those were among young women, while 4 were among men. In that review, we found that transactional sex plays an important role in explaining women's disproportionate risk of HIV in Sub-Saharan Africa. And evidence also from the systematic review showed that this practice is significantly associated with HIV prevalence for young women, and results among young men were inconclusive. So it's not clear how it might actually contribute to risk among young men. One of the studies included was employed a longitudinal design and reported an increase in HIV incidence resulting from this practice. Of the 6 studies that provided data on adolescent girls and young women in particular, 4 found a significant association between transactional sex and HIV. Together, these studies suggest the risk of being HIV positive is actually nearly 1.5 to about 2 times higher for adolescent girls who transact sex compared to those who report not transacting. 8 of the 12 studies among all women also showed a significant relationship between the practice and HIV. In this figure, shows the results of the meta-analysis of the relationship between transactional sex and prevalent HIV infection among women. We see that all the 5 odds ratios relating to women were above 1, indicating a positive relationship between transactional sex and HIV. We also see that the 3 of the 5 odds ratios were statistically significant, and the pooled odds ratio, which can of course be interpreted as the average association between transactional sex and HIV infection, was estimated at 1.92, which is almost 2. So we actually clearly see there's a relationship based on that meta-analysis. Moving to our next question within the working group, which was how can we improve the measurement of transactional sex? We've realized that while the expansion of research on this on transactional sex and its role on HIV is commendable, there's also growing diversity on how people are actually defining and measuring this practice, making comparison across settings really difficult. But what is most worrying, of course, is the way transactional sex itself is being conflated with sex work. And of course, someone can ask that why should we worry about that conflation? We think it's really important that these practices are understood as really different because they involve different populations, but they're also likely to contribute to HIV prevalence in different ways. Also, just taking intervention towards the practices, we see that these are practices that would require different interventions. So it's really clear that they're understood as different practices. Here are some of the examples of questions that have been used to measure the prevalence of transactional sex. And as we can see, these questions have varied significantly. And we can also see actually that these questions may not be capturing transactional sex, but actually conflating it with sex work. For example, the question, have you ever paid for sex? Clearly, to us, that sounds as if that study is measuring sex work and not transactional sex. Of worth noting is that there are questions that seem to do a much better job of capturing the necessary nuances. And an example is the last question that we see here that was developed by Dunkel and has been used by Jukes and others. And if I read it out, have you ever become involved with a roll-on, once-off main partner, because he provided you with, or you expected that he would provide you with any of the following: food, cosmetics, clothes, transportation, school fees, somewhere to sleep, or cash? This question was actually very important in helping us develop our questions. In helping us to develop our questions using cognitive interviews that I'll talk about next. Given the variations that we've actually just seen in those questions, we set out to conduct some cognitive interviews in Tanzania and in Uganda with an aim of developing a measure that differentiates transactional sex from sex work. But also we aimed to develop a question that could facilitate, successful answers. And below I describe how we went about doing the study population that we conducted the cognitive interviews with. These were done with adolescent girls and young women aged 14 to 24 years, and adult men aged 20 to 35, and some that were older. Interviews were conducted in 2 iterations with 18 men and 80 women in the 2 countries. Participants were sampled based on characteristics such as residence, schooling status, and age. And we tested 6 question variations for women and 4 for men. Next slide. Here are some examples of questions that we actually call draft questions because it's still work in process. But we've suggested these as some of the questions that could actually be used to measure the practice. Just taking the example on the questions of women, we see that the question that was used in Uganda was in the past 12 months, have you entered into a sexual relationship with anyone in order to receive money, help to pay your expenses, or to receive things that are important to you? While in Tanzania, we came to a conclusion that the following question would work better. In the last 12 months, have you started a sexual relationship with a man in order to get things that you needed, or money or gifts? As you can see, there are some slight differences in how these questions are worded between the 2 countries. That is something that's going to be expected in as much as we come up with a proposed question that can be used across settings in Sub-Saharan Africa. But wording might actually vary slightly depending on what will make sense in a particular setting. But what I would like to pick out is the words that we've actually used in coming up with these draft measurement questions. The phrase, for example, sexual relationships, was intended to point out that exchange is embedded in these relationships. We also tested have sex with, become sexually involved with, have a relationship with, and the intention of testing out all these variations was to try and balance between identifying a phrase that did not suggest sex work, but also was not heard as judgmental or immoral or stigmatizing, thus resulting to underreporting among the participants. We also see a distinct phrase which is in order to, pointing to motivations underlying these relationships, and we continue to struggle with ensuring that participants hear the motivation and the notion that they are engaging in these relationships for the reason of accessing money or materials. For the questions relating to men, what I would like to pick out as really standing out is the phrase "other than sex worker." We found that to be really helpful in the two settings, in the two countries, because it helped men differentiate their relationships from those that were actually sex work affiliated. And therefore, we found that phrase to be really important in helping men focus on transactional relationships versus those that were sex work. So I'll hand it over to my colleague, Kirsten, to present on our third key question within the working group.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and I'm so glad you were able to present those slides on behalf of the working group. We got through the technological issues. So to end, we want to talk about the work that we've done looking at the different motivations for practicing transactional sex. This work has been published recently in Social Science and Medicine, and that paper should be available on the Strive website if you're interested in understanding this in more depth. I'll be giving just a brief overview of it right now. In this work, we conducted a comprehensive review of the social science literature on transactional sex and identified three main sets of motivations that we describe as different paradigms of transactional sex, or how transactional sex has been framed in the literature over time. And we argue, as much of the literature suggests, that these paradigms are in fact interrelated as they're shown on this diagram. But we've separated these out in order to highlight what's left aside if one is emphasized at the expense of others. And the reason for this is because looking at one perspective or paradigm of transactional sex unidimensionally would have implications for intervention approaches and strategies, and we wanted to highlight the consequences of drawing from too narrow a perspective of the practice. I'm going to go through each of these paradigms. The first is sex for basic needs, which stresses the role of gendered poverty in pushing women to exchange sex for basic subsistence needs, and that's sometimes also referred to as survival sex. And this paradigm emphasizes women's economic dependence on men and their vulnerability or relative powerlessness in transactional sex relationships. Women, and especially younger women or girls, are described as victims of men's advances within relationships where men express a dominant masculinity, an expression of masculinity that's upheld by demonstrating success in having many women and having control over women. And that is framed particularly within the context of age disparate or sugar daddy relationships where the partnership is between an older man with a younger woman. Chronologically, this is the first paradigm to emerge in the literature, and we expected to see it as more common in earlier studies. But we noted that that literature that drew from this perspective was pretty steady over time, but shifted in terms of the voice, coming from initially academic writing to more recently programmatic reports coming out of NGOs and other institutes. And just one example of transactional sex being framed in this way is seen in this quote in blue, which I'll read. A rural out-of-school 17-year-old female related how the financial dependency that she had on her partner, who was 15 years older than she, trapped her in a physically dangerous and emotionally damaging relationship. More recently, studies have described an additional set of motivations for the practice of transactional sex that we summarize as sex for improved social status. And this paradigm stresses the influence of economic inequality, and the importance of consumer goods for social status and aspirations for a better life. And many studies drawing out of this perspective describe transactional sex among not so poor young women in urban settings who are seeking the stuff of modernity. This paradigm then challenges that of basic needs by first suggesting that women practice transactional sex not just for survival, but for modern material goods, and also challenges the position that women have in these relationships. Some of these studies reference women's erotic agency within the context of transactional sex relationships. Many studies draw different phrases that young women use to describe the ways they go about exploiting men for their money, or nicknames that they have for men in these relationships, like Minister of Finance or Minister of Transport. This paradigm also suggests that women practice transactional sex not just for economic, but also social reasons, to keep up with their peers or to access new, wealthier social networks by looking the part of a modern young woman. And while there is an emphasis on women's agency in these relationships, there's certainly also a recognition that there are important areas where that agency has limits, particularly around often sexual decision-making. So one quote that describes captures this paradigm is here on the slide. It says, using their sexuality to access goods and services is constructed as a pragmatic adaptation to modern and costly urban life. And finally, the final paradigm that was present in the literature is what we're calling sex and material expressions of love. And this paradigm really stresses more than anything that exchange is embedded in romantic relationships, and that men's provision of financial support is a symbol of commitment and love. And also it emphasizes the role of men as providers of material support in relationships, the expectation that men will provide, and that provision is tied to ideals about masculinity or a male provider role. These expectations of provision are also often upheld by women, but in being upheld by women can serve to maintain gender inequality in relationships, which is something that's noted in this rather lengthy quote in the blue box here that comes out of an urban South African setting that discusses the ties between the sex for improved social status paradigm and this one, and says, girls' ideals of love are tied to their aspirations toward middle-class consumerism. Upholding provider masculinity is a strategic means to claim money, fashionable clothes, and prestige, and love is produced by particular sets of economic and social circumstances through which gender inequalities are reproduced. But I also do want to emphasize the extent to which literature describes how much provision and love are really interdependent and inextricable, and that men, by providing and fulfilling the expectation of provision, denote love and commitment in relationships. And as one research participant remarked, how will I know if he likes me if he doesn't buy me nice things? So back to bringing these paradigms together, we wish to emphasize that the motivations depicted in each are all responding to, at the macro level, rapid economic and social change that includes income inequality and also related gender poverty, and an increase in the global diffusion of goods, media, and other projections of middle-class status and lifestyles that young people the world over are aspiring to. And in addition, at each level of aggregation and for each paradigm, systems of gender inequality structure the practice of transactional sex. So at the macro or distal level, unequal distributions of opportunities and resources mean women on the whole have fewer resources to draw from than men. And at the interactional community and couple level, expectations around men's roles as providers and expectations of men as authority figures in relationships are going to direct household and relationship dynamics. And finally, those same expectations will be internalized at the individual level into individual gender attitudes and beliefs. And we would like to suggest that rather than paradigms, it might be more productive to consider a series of continua that run across these paradigms. At the contextual level is a continuum of deprivation that runs from absolute to relative, emphasizing that transactional sex takes place across a range of socioeconomic contexts. And importantly to point out that aspirational motivations are not necessarily absent from rural poor contexts, as well as basic needs can certainly also drive transactional sex in some urban settings or specific neighborhoods within urban settings. Second is a continuum of agency running from vulnerable victim to powerful agent. This continuum draws attention to variation in the extent to which women are in control of their choices within transactional sex relationships. It's important to recognize that even in the context of poverty, women may express some degree of agency with respect to, for example, her choice of partner. And finally is a continuum of instrumentality, or the degree to which these relationships are motivated by financial or material gain. And research has shown that exchange is embedded in most relationships. The extent to which these potential financial benefits or status are driving women's engagement in any given relationship is really important for us to be able to understand. And this understanding, this more complex understanding of transactional sex has implications for intervention approaches. First, as we see from the sex and material expressions of love paradigm, this emphasizes that exchange is embedded in heterosexual relationships. So the goal should not necessarily, we would argue, be to eliminate all relationships that include exchange, but rather to identify, for the purposes of intervention, those relationships that are really motivated by exchange and focus on trying to reduce reliance on those such relationships. In addition, it was clear from descriptions of the sex for improved social status paradigm that not all transactional sex takes place within the context of poverty, and not all women see themselves as vulnerable victims in these relationships. And that's important as in reviewing intervention strategies that try to address transactional sex directly. We see that by and large, these intervention strategies are really addressing transactional sex from that sex for basic needs set of understandings. Most of these interventions are targeted age disparate relationships with sugar daddies and take an approach of blaming and shaming men while trying to protect young women and girls. But we would argue that if women and men don't see themselves as the characters portrayed in the sex for basic needs paradigm, that these approaches may be falling on deaf ears for some, as not all women understand their relationship in transactional sex relationships. They don't understand their position necessarily as vulnerable, but sometimes rather as powerful. So this leads to some recommendations for interventions. And we certainly recognize that transactional sex is among a cluster of risk behaviors that contribute to young women's disproportionate risk of HIV. And we would argue that a strong intervention approach would be to ensure that transactional sex is addressed in contextually appropriate ways within the context of multi-component interventions that can address the social and structural drivers of HIV risk for adolescent girls and young women. So we would suggest that intervention efforts can account for the context-specific conditions and circumstances that increase HIV risk through transactional sex when planning and designing such multi-component programs, which we would argue should address both economic vulnerability and gender norms. One recommendation is to conduct rapid assessments to determine what specific material conditions, beliefs, norms, and aspirations are driving risk through transactional sex in any particular setting, and to then design interventions to reduce the structural drivers of transactional sex, again, primarily economic vulnerability and gender inequality. It would suggest that we need to address economic vulnerability as one key structural driver of transactional sex risk, but we need to recognize that these contexts different socioeconomic contexts may suggest different approaches. So in context of uniform poverty and with highly vulnerable populations, we would suggest that strategies such as access to cash or cash transfers or income generating activities would be more likely to be successful in reducing reliance on transactional sex, but that in context of growing income inequality, more akin to a sex for improved social status paradigm, we would emphasize rather a critical reflection approach to help young women separate needs from wants, to manage their short-term versus long-term aspirations and goals, challenge powers of peer pressure and global marketing to influence their desires, and consider the costs and benefits of using relationships as a strategy for social mobility. And lastly, we would recommend addressing gender inequality as another key structural driver of transactional sex risk, but would highlight that, again, not all women are approaching or see themselves as vulnerable victims, to ensure that these sorry, I think I just accidentally moved slides. To ensure that we can critically address agency and power, norms around men as providers, and the benefits and drawbacks of older partners. And also that we would certainly want to engage men and boys, as well as adolescent girls and young women, in programs to encourage gender equitable relationships. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge the support that we have from our STRIVE affiliated members, and give thanks to a number of external experts who have guided us along the way, and then certainly recognize the UK aid from the Department for International Development for funding the STRIVE Research Consortium. And we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot so much, you guys. That was a really nice overview of quite a bit of work. And so we do have now about 20 minutes in which we can entertain questions or comments. Okay, so while people are thinking, let me start with one. I was hoping that perhaps you could say a bit about the notion of your three paradigms that you presented at the end, where you were speaking in terms of sort of different paradigms. Are there pure examples of these paradigms, or are you suggesting through your diagram that all relationships have elements of the three?
That's a really good question. I suspect that, I think there are perhaps some examples where there are more closer to pure examples of these different. I'm thinking with the sex for basic needs paradigm, certainly research that looks at particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups, for example, street children who engage in exchange-based relationships for survival are likely hewing very closely to that sort of ideal type paradigm. They are in a extremely compromised position in transactional sex relationships. That said, some research describes how notions of resistance among those even the most marginalized. So I think just allowing for recognizing that there are places of resistance that can be harnessed is important. And in terms of the Sex for Improved Social Status, I'd say some of the qualitative research that looks at young women in the university setting is probably hewing most closely to the sort of ideal type understanding of that paradigm, where these are women who are relatively well off to be able to be in a university setting. But again, in the research there, we certainly see areas where these young women find themselves in really compromised positions within the context of sexual decision making with some of their older partners, and relate unwanted sexual activity that may occur, where they feel that they have little choice as a result of having received so much from a specific partner in question. So yes and no, I guess, is the answer.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions coming in through the chat box. One is from a colleague who says, could you go over again specifically the major difference between, or distinctions between transactional sex and sex work?
Yeah. Transactional sex is actually distinct from sex work in different ways. And one of them is that within transactional sex, we are talking about boyfriends and girlfriends or lovers, while in sex work, it's actually clients and clients of sex workers. So usually the language between these two to start with is actually very different. But also in transactional sexual relationships, actually embedded within, there's love actually that is implicit in some of those relationships. They involve some aspect of emotion, but also the exchange is implicit. It's never negotiated upfront the way we would actually see in sex work relationships. So yes, we agree that these relationships might actually appear on a continuum, and sometimes there's a bit of an overlap based on the characteristics that I've actually just described, the implicit assumptions characterizing transactional, while the explicit negotiation of the exchange being a major characteristic of sex work. But also emotionality is a really common characteristic of transactional sex versus sex work. But we agree that there's some overlap at some point, because we can say that this transactional sex and HIV is actually on a continuum, so they can overlap at some point, but the distinguishing features are what I've just mentioned there.
Great, thank you. And I also think another one that comes through is that the girls and women themselves would not put themselves in the category of sex worker. So they don't accept or identify with the notion of sex work. So if you have a intervention, obviously, that is framed in terms of sex work, it's going to entirely miss these young women. Another question that I think is quite interesting is from Gabrielle. She says she's worried that the majority of studies that we cite seem to be from South Africa, and yet we broadly say from our title that we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa. And she wonders to what extent are regional or cultural variations taken into consideration.
That's a really good question, Gabrielle, and thank you for asking it. I think part of the problem is just that I made the mistake of having all three quotes come from South Africa for each of the paradigms. But part of you are picking up on the fact that certainly there more has been written about transactional sex, both in social science literature, as well as in our understanding of the epidemiological association between transactional sex and HIV. There is certainly a skewed amount of evidence coming from South Africa. That said, our review of the social science drew on a wide number of countries. I wish I could give you the number, but captured all regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, from west to east, central to south, and the conceptualization we sort of purposely and maybe a bit to a disservice to the topic, wanted to boil down what we saw as commonalities across contexts. But that said, there are some important contextual differences, one of which is the extent to which in some settings versus others, the practice of transactional sex is considered more versus less normative, so more versus less stigmatized. I can say just I think we need to look at this more closely, some of these different contextual differences. But for example, most of the qualitative research, at least that I've seen coming out of Mozambique, hews a bit more closely to the sort of sex for improved social status perspective, while a lot of the literature that comes from, for example, Malawi, is drawing more from either sex for basic needs or some combination of that, and the linkages between provision and love is more emphasized in that setting. So there are certainly important contextual differences that I think we need to be able to account for more going forward.
Great. So we have a question on measurement from Sarah Magny, and she notes that in qualitative research in South Africa, they see that interviewees report high levels of transactional sex, but it's their experience in quantitative surveys that the levels of transactional sex that are reported are far lower, and she says usually around 7% in national surveys that have been done, presumably in South Africa. Do you think that using a refined measure of transactional sex will bring these perceptions or these notions closer together?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sarah. And just to respond, I think one of the things that actually we were working on in the cognitive interview is actually to get a question that would make participants respond truthfully, but without really stigmatizing them in any way. So we are hoping actually with an improved measure, participants should be able to actually respond honestly, and we hope given that then we might get really responses that reflect the actual practice. So if the feeling that lots of it is actually happening, then we are likely to get that with a better measure. So we'll see. But yeah, so those are some of the suggestions that we give there.
And also just to note, one of the things that we are continuing to do is to take these questions to new sites. Right now we only have, as you saw, the cognitive interviews, the kind of in-depth discussions with people about how they understand the language of the different questions in two settings in two countries. But we're moving forward to do that in 2 more countries. So hopefully we'll have a little bit more confidence, which is why we're very much presenting the questions that you have, that we've presented or that our colleagues have presented on the slide as draft at this point. So we have another question from Yael Asgad. She says, I was wondering in terms of HIV interventions that address transactional sex beyond the kind of sugar daddy victim paradigm, do you have any examples of projects that are currently doing this? And would it be it would be interesting to hear some examples if you've come across any.
I do not, but there's so many folks on the call right now. I would love to know if anyone else does, because from what we've gathered from the published literature on interventions that again are explicitly addressing transactional sex. By and large, we've seen this pattern of looking at it in this way. That said, there are certainly interventions that are addressing adolescent girls and or adolescent girls and young women's risk of HIV from a more structural approach or more generally, and some of those interventions have been evaluated to determine whether or not they impacted on transactional sex, but they weren't necessarily aiming explicitly to do so. So among those that that we are aware of that have explicitly aimed to reduce reliance on transactional sex, we haven't seen. But I would love if anyone else has something to add to that. I would love to hear that myself. I think that's a very, very good question.
So if anyone does, please make yourself known through the chat box. I want to go up. I have a couple of hands raised. One is Anna Forbes. If you want to hit *7 and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. It seems to me that sex as a material expression of love is a very deeply culturally accepted concept. So I would think that efforts to employ interventions that challenge this paradigm by empowering women could generate some serious cultural backlash. In the U.S., regrettably, we're experiencing that serious political backlash right now, and it's not pretty. I wonder, did you see any evidence of that efforts to empowering women as a challenge to the validity of that paradigm? Did you see any backlash to that or evidence of it?
That's a really good question, and let me think. I mean, first I'd say that in our recommendations right now, as we've laid them out, we're not actually suggesting that we would want to challenge. As you note, it is very culturally laden, and I think our approach is more a recognizing that this is a very fundamental gendered expectation in many relationships the world over, and certainly we would like to promote the idea of interventions that can begin to help critically address some of those expectations, particularly around assumptions around women's economic dependence on men, but are not necessarily. We wouldn't want to suggest that that the effort should be to undo all exchange in relationships. And I don't know if I'm answering your question well enough, or Joyce, if you'd like to to add anything to that, or Lori.
Yeah. So maybe just to add on what Kirsten has said, our intention was really just to bring out how authors and other people have actually written about this practice, and to actually highlight that the motivations behind it are multiple, in as much as people might focus on sex, for example, for basic needs. So when we talk about interventions, we actually reflect on interventions that could reduce risky aspects of the transactional sex relationships. So for example, in the situation of sex for material expressions of love, for me, just taking through an intervention would be looking at what love means in those particular settings, and what aspects of transactional sex that are intertwined with love that are actually causing risk. So it's really just flagging that this is another important motivation that young women might be in relationships that might involve some aspect of risk, because even love relationships could be risky at some point, but not saying that we want to stop transactional sex. So culturally, yes, it might remain that way, but we might address what aspects of love are actually problematic.
Thank you.
Right. So we do have a comment here from Gabrielle, and noting that transactional sex does not always confer exchange of anything apart from affection and emotions, or at least I think that's how they're interpreting what you're saying. The distinction you gave between transactional sex and sex work is not very clear. I wonder if you could perhaps speak to that question.
Transactional sex does not always confer exchange of anything apart from affection and emotions. I think, one thing that we're trying to argue in our definition of transactional sex and in the way that we are aiming to measure it is in fact to suggest that there is exchange of more than emotions and affection, but that these are relationships that are motivated by, that, and I think this maybe gets to Anna's point as well, that we're interested. We feel that where there's likely more risk involved are those relationships that are primarily motivated by an instrumental intention, or motivated by the expectation of financial support, or the expectation of access to social status, right? And for those relationships where all that's being exchanged is affection and emotion, we do not feel that there is need to, intervene as transactional sex, as defining that as transactional sex. In terms of, distinguishing transactional sex from sex work, I think the difference is that transactional sex is implicit. These exchanges are implicit rather than explicitly negotiated. And back to just to reemphasize what Lori said, young women and men who are engaged in relationships where there is a mutual implicit understanding that he is there to get access to sex and she is there to get access to things, do not define themselves as clients or sex workers, and would not be defined that way by their fellow community members as well. These are, relationships, defined as relationships. They may be very, very short term, but they're not understood as interactions between a sex worker and her client. And I hope that's clear. But I like Joyce said, I do certainly agree that the reason that this is so difficult to sort of nail down is because it's complicated.
Right. So I guess I would just add, I think we would say as the working group that if it were just sex in terms of exchange of emotion or sex and provision, kind of a classic in the literature has talked about patriarchal bargain, that the expectation that women's roles in relationship are to do certain things and men's roles are to do other things, including to provide. We wouldn't include that within the definition of transactional sex. But that expectation and that piece of the puzzle frequently helps to justify and is piquantly part of the way women think about their relationships, even if they are transactional. One of the questions here, which I think is quite important, has to do with the relationship and how to conceptualize the relationship between transactional sex and sex work. Not necessarily definitionally, but they're saying if you were designing interventions, would you put sex work under the umbrella of transactional sex? So is sex work a subset of transactional sex, or the other way around, or neither? I'm adding the neither. But I think frequently we see these things visually displayed or discussed as either subsets of each other. Do you think that's an accurate portrayal, or is it better to see them as parallel and separate or along a continuum?
I can start. I think this is really, when we first gathered as a working group, one thing that we discussed was whether or not we should try to lobby for a new term instead of transactional sex because of this confusion. But it's been out there for so long that we felt that probably was not a fight worth fighting. But we would not argue that that transactional sex is an umbrella term under which there are many different forms of exchange inclusive of sex work. Rather, we would argue that transactional sex is mostly distinct from sex work and I guess on a continuum of exchange-based relationships that's how we would argue it as a. So in terms of thinking about interventions, and that's important when thinking about interventions because, as we're suggesting, young women who are in implicit exchange-based relationships will not respond to interventions that are directed at sex workers, as they don't see themselves as sex workers. And many of the aspects around sex work that would put a sex worker at risk are very different in terms of the social practices and the gendered practices that lead to risk within what we're defining as transactional sex. And Joyce, I don't know if you want to add to that, or Lori.
Well, I would just say one of the interesting things that we found when we went back to look at the evolution of the term and the introduction of the phrase transactional sex is that actually it was created as part of kind of critical social science specifically to distinguish from sex work. Because in the very, very early days of the HIV epidemic, what you saw was that people were basically framing, vast majorities of the sexual behavior of people within various different African settings as sex work, and using that term and applying that term clearly to behaviors where it was inappropriate, and there was the need arose to have a way to talk about relationships that did have some element of exchange, but clearly did not meet the local or even global sort of understanding of sex work as a profession. So we have one last, well, actually two last questions. One is from an observation from Nambusi Kayagomba. Do you want to unmute yourself and offer your reflections about the BRAC program, Nambusi?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I tried earlier and couldn't quite get through. This is perhaps a bit of a delayed response. It was in response to the question about whether there are any examples of interventions that relate to motivations for transactional sex that are not related to sugar daddies. And one example is a program by BRAC. It's called ELA, Empowerment and Livelihoods for Adolescents. It's currently active in 6 countries in the global south, mainly Africa, and I think in India as well. And in Uganda, at least, the BRAC program is linking the empowerment and livelihood, so an opportunity for adolescent girls to be supported for income generation, with critical reflection on risk related to relationship choices, including HIV. And essentially what this is attempting to do is to combine a structural intervention that attempt to enable young women or young adolescents or girls to have access to resources that they themselves control, whilst combining that with a critical reflection, as Kirsten mentioned earlier in the call, about what it means, for example, to delay purchase of something, not rely on a man for access to whatever resources they need, but then critically recognizing that in the structural context where they do not have access to cash or to resources, the combination of the structural and the critical reflection is a way of reducing that vulnerability.
Great, thank you. For people who are interested, there is some information about that program on the STRIVE website, and I'm sure additional information available through the BRAC, which is the Bangladesh Research, or BRAC, for those who are interested. Just one final question, and I think we'll have to sign off, is from Esther Manjani. She asked if we know anything about the socio-demographic factors that are associated with the probability of having young women or adolescent girls or young women become involved in transactional sex.
Yeah, Joyce, do you want to start or do you want me to?
You can start off.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, yes, we do. We know some things. We know that early sexual debut is associated with probability of engaging in transactional sex. We know that, as Joyce presented in an earlier slide, we know that experiences of abuse and different forms of violence are associated with transactional sex. Mind you, most of those studies have come from South Africa. In terms of more socioeconomic determinants, this is where I think the quantitative studies sort of underlie or support the different paradigms we described, as while we see in some smaller regional studies evidence that some evidence that poverty or lower household wealth is predictive of engagement in transactional sex. In other large cross-national studies conducted at a national level, we see no relationship between income, poverty, or household wealth and engagement in transactional sex, and that might be reflective of the fact that transactional sex is a strategy used by women in across different socioeconomic strata. And let's see what else. In some studies, there is an association between lower levels of education and practice of transactional sex, but again, that is not consistent across all studies. And I'm trying to think if there are some other big ones that I'm missing. I'm not sure. Maybe Joyce or Lori has
and just to add on what Christina said, as you said, actually, the way forward, one of the efforts that the Transactional Sex Working Group is involved in is actually to improve a measure that captures this practice properly, and so that we actually can see the associations between it and HIV, because that's one thing that is unclear. But just looking at risky practices for the few studies that have actually looked at transactional sex itself, and I'm saying few because studies don't set out to just explore transactional sex. It's one of the many behaviors that are within a study that is actually exploring behavioral factors. So you'd find that you'd find the studies interested in multiple partners, condom use, and so many other things. And transactional sex would actually just come in as one of the factors. So few studies actually link those factors because they don't set out to explore transactional sex as a main factor. But having said that, we've seen some associations already between transactional sex and some behavioral factors. As mentioned earlier, we've seen association with multiple partners among adolescents. We've also seen issues around condom use. Although again, we say it's really little evidence on that, and the studies on that are less conclusive. And hence, we just hope with an improved measurement question, then we can really be able to find out what's happening between this practice and increased risk among adolescents.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our speakers for a really interesting presentation, and I want to thank everyone for hanging in with us.